Is it possible that the fiercest battles we face are not the ones fought on distant shores, but the ones waged in the deafening silence of a peaceful home? For former Marine Jackson, that silence was shattered when a historic flood forced him to plunge into a raging river to rescue a drowning German shepherd puppy. But what began as a desperate fight against the freezing water would soon reveal a profound truth: that sometimes the fragile life we risk everything to save is exactly the one destined to rescue us in return. Please subscribe to the Canine Instinct channel, and let's begin today's story. I am Jackson, a former United States Marine, and if my years of service taught me anything, it is that chaos rarely offers a warning before it strikes. The year 2023 brought a storm to Morgan City, Louisiana, that the locals would speak of for decades. The Atchafalaya River, usually a steady and familiar presence, transformed into a raging force of nature. It breached its banks with a terrifying speed, pouring millions of gallons of muddy, churning water into the quiet suburban streets. The flood swallowed manicured lawns, drowned the porches of family homes, and turned familiar intersections into deep, dangerous channels. The relentless drumming of the heavy rain against my roof had been my only company for 2 days. Inside my perfectly organized, silent house, I felt a familiar restlessness. The military had trained me to act, to protect, and to move towards the crisis rather than away from it. Peacetime had given me a safe home, but it had also given me a profound sense of isolation. Watching the brown water rise past the mailbox at the end of my driveway, I knew I could not simply sit and wait. I moved with the practiced efficiency of a soldier preparing for a patrol. I secured my heavy-duty life jacket, tightening the nylon straps until they dug comfortably into my shoulders. Around my waist, I fastened my everyday carry survival kit, feeling the reassuring weight of my tactical flashlight, a multi-tool, a heavy metal canteen of fresh water, and a waterproof emergency blanket. Stepping out onto the submerged porch, the cold wind bit through my layers, carrying the harsh, metallic scent of the overflowing river. My flat-bottomed aluminum motorboat was tethered to one of the porch columns, rising steadily with the floodwaters. I climbed aboard, primed the small outboard motor, and pulled the starter cord. The engine roared to life, a steady mechanical vibration that cut through the howling wind. I steered the boat away from my property and navigated out into what used to be Elm Street. The neighborhood was an unrecognizable landscape. Debris of all kinds, shattered lawn furniture, wooden fence panels, and torn branches flowed past me in the dark, rushing water. I kept the throttle low, my eyes scanning the windows and rooftops of the submerged houses, looking for anyone who might have been trapped by the sudden surge. As I approached the intersection of Main Street, the current intensified, funneled between a row of sturdy brick commercial buildings. It was there, amidst the swirling chaos of the flash flood, that I saw it. Caught in a violent eddy was a large, heavy rubber tire. Clinging to the edge of the wet, black rubber was a German shepherd puppy. The creature could not have been more than 8 weeks old. His fur was plastered to his frail body, and his head barely stayed above the churning surface. He was completely exhausted, his small paws slipping repeatedly against the slick surface of the tire. Every time he slipped, he fought with a desperate, wild energy to pull his chin back up. My chest tightened. In the military, we lived by a sacred ethos: leave no man behind. Watching this tiny, innocent creature fighting a losing battle against an overwhelming force of nature triggered something deep within me. I was not going to let this river take him. I angled the boat against the heavy current, fighting the steering arm to keep the vessel steady. The water here was moving dangerously fast, surging like a natural rapid. My training dictated my next moves. I could not risk a blind grab that might capsize the boat. I spotted a tall, sturdy streetlight pole rising from the water just a few yards from the struggling puppy. I maneuvered the boat alongside the metal pole, grabbed the thick nylon mooring line from the bow, and quickly secured it around the unyielding steel. The line pulled tight instantly as the current fought to push the boat away, but the knot held fast. With the boat stabilized, I leaned heavily over the gunwale. The freezing rain lashed against my face, blinding me, but I kept my focus entirely on the frightened animal. I stretched my arm out over the churning water. The puppy let out a weak, desperate whimper, a sound barely audible over the roaring storm. My gloved hand reached his scruff. I closed my grip securely and hoisted his soaking, shivering body out of the freezing water and pulled him tightly against my chest. In that brief moment, I felt a massive surge of relief. But the river was not finished with us. A sudden, deep groaning of breaking timber echoed from upstream, louder than the wind. I snapped my head up just in time to see an immense, fully uprooted oak tree hurtling down the flooded street directly toward my position. The massive trunk and tangled roots were being driven forward by the full force of the flash flood. There was no time to untie the knot. There was no time to start the engine. The collision was catastrophic. The immense weight of the oak tree slammed into the stern of my aluminum boat. The impact was a violent shockwave that threw me completely off balance. The metal hull buckled instantly, screaming under the immense pressure. The heavy nylon mooring line, pulled beyond its limits, snapped with a violent whip. The outboard motor was crushed into useless scrap, and the boat began to fold and sink under the overwhelming weight of the tree. The river poured over the sides in a rushing torrent. I had no choice. Wrapping both arms securely around the puppy, I abandoned the sinking wreckage and plunged backward into the icy, churning abyss. The shock of the cold water stole the breath from my lungs. The current immediately gripped us, tossing us like weightless debris. I fought the panic, relying on muscle memory. I kicked my heavy boots, fighting my way to the surface, holding the puppy high above my head to keep him from swallowing the muddy water. Through the driving rain, I spotted a delivery truck parked near the side of a convenience store. The water had risen halfway up the truck's windshield. Just beyond the truck was the store's wide, flat metal awning, sitting just above the waterline. It was our only chance. I swam with one arm, pulling fiercely against the rushing tide. The physical exertion was agonizing. My muscles burned, and the cold seeped into my bones, but I refused to let go of the small life in my arms. I reached the submerged hood of the delivery truck. The metal was slick, but my heavy boots found a momentary edge against the grill. Using the hood as a submerged springboard, I channeled every ounce of remaining strength from my legs. I pushed off with explosive force, launching my upper body out of the water. I threw my free arm over the solid edge of the convenience store awning, my fingers digging desperately into the metal trim. Hanging there, the rushing water pulled relentlessly at my legs, trying to drag me back down. With a final, agonizing heave, I pulled my center of gravity over the edge and rolled onto the flat, hard surface of the awning, clutching the puppy to my chest. We lay there in the pouring rain, my chest heaving as I pulled in ragged breaths. We were out of the water, but we were completely stranded. Night was rapidly falling, bringing a deeper, more dangerous cold. I sat up and looked at the puppy. He was shaking violently, his tiny body succumbing to hypothermia. I quickly unzipped my heavy tactical outer jacket. Underneath, I wore a thick, insulated fleece lining that had miraculously remained somewhat dry. I stripped the wet outer shell, and wrapped the soft, dry fleece securely around the shivering German shepherd. I pulled him tightly against my own chest, using my core body heat to fight the freezing temperature. Surrounded by an endless, dark ocean of turbulent water, sitting on an isolated metal roof, I held the small dog close. Our battle against the flood was far from over, but as the darkness closed in around Morgan City, we prepared to face the freezing night together. The darkness over Morgan City was absolute, broken only by the occasional distant sweep of a helicopter spotlight cutting through the heavy clouds. On the flat metal awning of the convenience store, the temperature plummeted, turning the relentless rain into a freezing mist. I sat with my back braced against the brick facade of the building, trying to shield the small bundle in my arms from the biting wind. The German Shepherd puppy was perilously close to the edge of survival. His violent shivering had subsided into a weak, shallow trembling, a dangerous sign that his core temperature was dropping too low. I tightened the dry fleece lining of my jacket around him, pulling his small frame flush against my chest. My military training had conditioned my body to endure brutal elements, but this animal had no such defenses. He needed warmth, and he needed hydration. Floodwater was toxic, a foul mix of chemicals, sewage, and debris. Drinking it would be a death sentence for a creature this young. Moving with slow, deliberate care to preserve our shared pocket of body heat, I reached for the heavy metal canteen attached to my survival kit. My fingers were stiff and numb, but I managed to unscrew the cap. I poured a small amount of the clean, purified water into the metal lid. I gently nudged the puppy's snout. He was lethargic, his eyes heavy and unfocused. I tilted the cap against his lower jaw, letting a few drops wet his tongue. At first, there was no response. Then, survival instinct took over. He let out a soft breath and began to lap at the water. I paced the rationing, offering him 3 small caps over the next hour. With the clean water in his system and the steady radiating heat from my chest, his breathing gradually deepened. I felt his small heart beating a steady rhythm against my ribs. In the oppressive darkness of the drowned town, surrounded by devastation, a silent bond took root between us. He was no longer just a rescue. He was my responsibility. We were going to see the morning together. The night stretched on, a grueling test of endurance. I kept my eyes on the dark horizon, tracking the slow passage of hours. Eventually, the punishing rain faded into a light drizzle, and the howling wind lost its aggressive edge. By the time the first pale gray light of dawn began to bleed through the heavy cloud cover, the physical dynamics of the flood had completely changed. The crest of the surge had passed through the town. The violent, rushing current that had destroyed my boat slowed, stalled, and finally ceased. The streets of Morgan City were now buried under millions of gallons of stagnant, murky water. With the cessation of the rushing water and howling wind, an eerie, unsettling silence blanketed the neighborhood. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a disaster zone in the aftermath, where the normal sounds of life, traffic, morning birds, the hum of electricity, had been entirely erased. I stretched my stiff, aching legs on the metal awning, watching the fog roll across the surface of the drowned streets. Beside me, the puppy shifted within the fleece wrapping. He was awake, his dark eyes clear and alert. He pushed his front paws against my chest, lifting his head into the cold morning air. Suddenly, his posture became rigid. His oversized, velvety ears snapped upward, swiveling like radar dishes toward the east. He let out a soft, anxious vocalization, followed by an urgent whine. He stood up unsteadily on the metal roof, his gaze locked intensely on a 2-story residential house sitting about 50 yards away, across the flooded intersection. I strained my ears, listening intently to the dead air. I heard nothing, only the gentle lapping of stagnant water against the brick walls below us. "What is it?" I whispered. The puppy stepped forward, his paws gripping the edge of the awning, and let out a series of sharp, urgent barks. He looked back at me, then back at the house, his entire body trembling with focused energy. In the Marines, you learn to trust the instincts of your working dogs implicitly. Their sensory perception operates on a level entirely alien to human capability. A German Shepherd's hearing is extraordinarily sharp, capable of detecting high frequencies and distant vibrations long before a human can register a sound. If he was alerting to that house, there was a reason. I secured the fleece jacket around him, ensuring he was safe on the wide awning, and stood up. I checked my survival gear, taking a deep breath of the damp air. "Stay," I commanded softly. The puppy watched me, whining, but held his position. I slid off the edge of the metal awning, dropping into the cold, dark water. Without the raging current, the flood water was manageable, but it was deep. It broke right at the center of my chest, heavy and resistant. I waded forward, using a slow, sweeping motion with my boots to feel for submerged vehicles, downed power lines, or hidden debris. As I closed the distance to the 2-story house, the oppressive silence remained. But when I reached the 20-yard mark, I finally heard it. It was a faint, rhythmic striking of metal against metal. It echoed weakly across the stagnant water, coming from the upper level of the house. The puppy had heard it from over 50 yards away, isolating that tiny, desperate rhythm from the ambient noise of the morning. I pushed through the water faster, reaching the side of the house. The lower level was completely submerged. I moved to the rear, finding a section of wooden lattice leading up to a second-story window. I gripped the wooden slats, testing their strength, and climbed upward, pulling myself out of the freezing water. The rhythmic striking grew louder. It was coming from the wooden attic vent near the roofline. I carefully scaled the sloping shingles of the lower roof, making my way to the small, slatted wooden vent. Through the gaps, I saw movement in the dim light of the crawlspace. "Hello. I am Jackson, former military. Are you hurt?" I called out, my voice breaking the morning silence. The striking stopped immediately. An exhausted, trembling voice called back, "Help! I am trapped. I cannot move my leg." I used my heavy multi-tool to pry the wooden slats of the vent loose, ripping them away to create an opening large enough to pull a man through. Inside the cramped, sweltering attic sat an elderly man. I recognized him from around the neighborhood. His name was George. He was clutching a heavy steel wrench, which he had been using to strike the iron plumbing pipe running along the floor joists. George was pale, his breathing shallow. A heavy wooden support beam had collapsed, pinning his lower leg and causing a deep, severe laceration. The makeshift cloth he had wrapped around it was completely soaked through, and he was losing blood at a dangerous rate. "I have you, George," I said, sliding into the narrow space. I immediately went to work. Falling back on the years of combat medical training, I retrieved a professional-grade tourniquet from my survival kit. I slid it high and tight around George's thigh, above the laceration, and engaged the windlass, twisting it until the severe bleeding stopped completely. I secured the rod and applied a heavy pressure dressing directly over the wound, wrapping it tightly with elastic bandages. "You did good, George. Keep breathing," I instructed, my voice calm and authoritative to keep his panic at bay. Using the leverage of my shoulders, I carefully lifted the collapsed beam just enough to slide his injured leg free. George groaned in pain, but he held strong. I braced his weight against my side and guided him slowly toward the broken vent opening. It took agonizing minutes of careful maneuvering, but I managed to hoist him through the opening and onto the stable section of the shingled roof. As I climbed out behind him, catching my breath in the cool morning air, a new sound cut through the silence. It was not a faint striking of metal, but the steady, powerful roar of an outboard motor. I stood up on the roofline, waving my arms high. A flat-bottomed rescue boat, operated by the local emergency services, rounded the corner of the flooded street, its wake cutting through the stagnant water. The crew spotted us immediately and altered their course toward the house. I looked back across the watery expanse toward the convenience store. Standing right at the edge of the metal awning, a tiny silhouette against the gray morning sky, the German Shepherd puppy was watching us. His sharp instincts had pierced the silence of a drowned city, reaching out across the water to save a life that would have otherwise slipped away. The rescue boat maneuvered carefully through the debris-laden water, its aluminum hull scraping gently against the submerged roofline of the house. Two emergency responders in bright, high-visibility vests reached over the gunnels, taking George into their careful grasp and lowering him onto the flat deck of the vessel. A medic immediately took over the first aid, praising the tight, professional tourniquet application that had saved the older man's life. I stayed on the roof just long enough to ensure George was stable before pointing the boat crew back across the flooded intersection toward the convenience store awning. They navigated the turbulent currents, arriving at the metal overhang where the tiny German Shepherd puppy was waiting. One of the responders climbed onto the awning, wrapping the small dog in a thick, dry thermal blanket. I watched from a distance as the boat carried them away toward the designated triage zone on higher ground. George was rushed to the regional hospital for emergency surgery, and the puppy was handed directly over to a disaster relief field veterinary station. As I watched the boat disappear around the bend of the flooded street, the adrenaline that had fueled me through the grueling night began to fade, leaving behind a heavy, profound exhaustion. By late afternoon, the emergency management teams had successfully evacuated the deeply flooded zones of Morgan City. I was transported back to my neighborhood, which sat on a slight elevation. The water here had receded into the storm drains, leaving behind a thick layer of brown river mud and scattered debris across the lawns. I walked up my driveway and unlocked my front door. I stepped inside, closing the heavy wooden door behind me. The latch engaged with a firm, final lock, completely sealing off the chaotic aftermath of the Great Flood of 2023. My home was impeccably organized. Every piece of furniture was aligned perfectly. The floors were spotless, the air smelled of crisp linen, and the temperature was perfectly controlled. For years, I had maintained this house with the strict discipline of a United States Marine. I had built it to be a sanctuary, a secure perimeter against an unpredictable world. Yet standing in the center of my living room, the absolute safety of the space suddenly felt entirely wrong. The silence in the house was absolute and suffocating. In the military, during combat deployments, silence was never a comfort. It was usually a warning that something terrible was about to happen. Coming home from service, the sudden transition to a quiet civilian life is often the hardest battle a veteran faces. Without a mission, without a team relying on you, a perfectly safe house can easily turn into an emotional bunker. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the empty table. I thought about the previous night. Out there in the freezing rain, stranded on a metal roof surrounded by an ocean of dark water, I had not felt lost. I had felt a burning, undeniable sense of purpose. Keeping that fragile, shivering creature alive had required everything I had to give. I remembered the weight of his small body pressed against my chest, the rhythm of his breathing synchronizing with mine as we fought the cold. That tiny animal had needed me to survive, but sitting alone in my immaculate house, I realized the sobering truth of the situation. I had needed him, too. The silence of peacetime was no longer something I wanted to endure alone. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and walked back out the door. The Disaster Relief Field Veterinary Station had been established inside the gymnasium of a local high school, set up on high ground a few miles away. The drive was slow, navigating around downed branches and utility crews working to restore power. When I walked through the double doors of the gymnasium, the atmosphere was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Rows of wire crates lined the polished wooden floor. Volunteers were moving rapidly between the enclosures, carrying clipboards, bags of dry food, and fresh towels. The air carried the strong scent of clinical antiseptic, mixed with the damp smell of wet fur. I approached the front desk and identified myself, explaining that I was the one who had pulled the German Shepherd puppy from the flooded intersection earlier that morning. A tired but smiling veterinary technician checked her records and led me down a long aisle of enclosures toward the back of the facility. "He has been quiet," the technician explained gently. "He was severely dehydrated and exhausted, but his core temperature is back to normal. We have been waiting to see if an owner would come looking for him, but he had no tags, no microchip, and no one has reported a missing dog matching his description." We stopped in front of a medium-sized wire crate lined with thick, clean blankets. Inside, the German Shepherd puppy was lying down, his chin resting on his front legs. He looked incredibly small in the daylight, his dark fur now dry and fluffy, though one of his hind legs was wrapped in a light protective bandage from scraping against the flood debris. I knelt down on the hard wooden floor, bringing myself to eye level with the enclosure. The technician unlatched the metal gate and swung it open. I waited, giving him the choice to move. In a shelter environment, many dogs would rush forward, vocalizing loudly and jumping in a frenzy of anxious energy. He did not. The puppy lifted his head, his dark, intelligent eyes locked onto my face. He recognized me immediately. He pushed himself up onto all four legs, his movements still a little unsteady from the ordeal. Slowly, he limped forward to the edge of the open crate. He did not bark. Instead, he lowered his head, reached out with one trembling front leg, and timidly placed his small paw directly into the palm of my open hand. I held my breath as his paw rested against my skin. Dogs do not experience the world exactly as humans do. They do not have sweat glands distributed across their bodies. Instead, their sweat glands and their most sensitive temperature receptors are concentrated almost entirely in the pads of their paws. When he pressed those dark, leathery pads tightly against my bare hand, it was not merely a gesture of greeting. It was an instinctive, biological search for the specific, familiar body heat that had shielded him from the freezing storm. He was seeking the exact temperature of the chest that had kept his heart beating through the darkest hours of the night. As I felt the warmth of his paw against my hand, the rigid, invisible walls I had built around myself since leaving the military simply collapsed. The profound isolation that had echoed through my pristine house vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of connection. He found the warmth he was looking for, and in his eyes, I saw the absolute trust of a comrade who knew we had survived the battle together. I gently wrapped my fingers around his paw and used my other hand to stroke the soft fur behind his ears. He leaned heavily into my touch, letting out a long, quiet sigh of contentment. I stood up and turned to the veterinary technician, who was watching the interaction with a soft smile. "Where are the adoption papers?" I asked. An hour later, I carried him out of the gymnasium and into the passenger seat of my truck. The storm had passed, and the late afternoon sun was finally breaking through the heavy clouds, casting a golden light across the recovering town of Morgan City. I looked over at the passenger seat. He was already curled into a tight circle, resting his head securely against my tactical jacket, fast asleep. I started the engine and put the vehicle into gear, heading back to the neighborhood. I had named him Bruno. My home would no longer be a silent, perfectly organized fortress designed to keep the world out. There would be dog toys scattered on the immaculate rugs, muddy paw prints on the pristine floors, and the sound of life echoing down the hallways. The Great Flood had taken much from the town, but it had brought me the one thing I needed most to navigate the quiet days of peace. I drove us home, leaving the isolation behind, ready to begin a new chapter filled with warmth, purpose, and a loyal friend by my side.